Coming up, the gap between us and them.
I actually think the moral law within is a mixed blessing. It allows us to get along with each other, but it also creates the modern moral problems that we face.
Harvard's Joshua Greene discusses the psychology of morality, the tragedy of the commons, and how different tribes can get along. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
It's a pleasure to welcome Joshua Greene to this public affairs program. His book is Moral Tribes: Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. As director of the Moral Cognition Lab at Harvard University's Department of Psychology, Josh has said that the purpose of his research is to understand how moral judgments are made and shaped, whether by automatic processes such as emotional gut reactions or by controlled cognitive processes such as reasoning and self-control.
What I'm going to do is try to get across three ideas. So one is what I call the tragedy of common sense morality. The other is the idea of morality fast and slow. And then finally, the idea of common currency. So starting with the tragedy of common sense morality. So the tragedy of common sense morality begins with a familiar parable that I think gets to the heart of what morality is really all about. So this is Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but I'll just recount the basic story. So you have a bunch of herders who are raising their sheep on a common pasture, and these are very rational herders, and they think to themselves, should I add another animal to my herd? And they say, well, when I get to market, if I have another animal, that's one more animal I can sell. That sounds good. That's the benefit. What's the cost? Well, the cost is not much. For me, it's grazing. The animals graze on this common pasture, and so I gain something substantial. I don't pay very much. I'll add another animal. And every herder has the same thought, and as a result, they grow and grow and grow their herds, and then it gets to a point where there are too many animals for the commons to support. And as a result, all the animals die, and everybody ends up being worse off. And this is the fundamental social dilemma. That is when there's a tension between what's good for me as an individual and what's good for us collectively. When our interests are perfectly aligned, there's no problem. And when our interests are perfectly opposed, there's a problem, but there's not really anything that we can do about it. Life gets interesting, and life is most interesting most of the time when there's a tension between the me perspective and the us perspective. But it's not a zero-sum game. What are the herders to do? Well, the answer to that is familiar. We need something like morality, perhaps morality codified in the form of law. So we say, okay, you have to limit your herds for the greater good. But it's not quite that simple, right? There are a lot of questions to be resolved when you try to think about this in more concrete terms. So do big families get more sheep? Is that fair? Well, the small families might not like that so much. Do you get the same number of sheep per family? Well, the big families might think that that's not exactly fair. And what if someone takes one of your animals? Can you defend your animals with an assault weapon? What happens if one of your animals gets sick? Are we going to have collective health insurance for our herds? There are a lot of different ways in which the problem of cooperation can be solved. So let me illustrate this point further with my own sequel to Hardin's parable. So imagine that you have this large forest, and around this very big forest, you have a lot of different tribes, and they're all raising their herds, but they raise their herds in different ways. They live in different ways. So over here you have, let's say, your individualist tribe, where they say, you know, enough of this common pasture. We're just going to privatize it. We're going to divide up the commons. Everybody gets their own plot of land, and that's one way of solving the problem. Now it's just everybody's on their own, and the cooperation consists in just everybody staying out of each other's territory. That can work, perhaps. Another way, the opposite extreme, is to have your communist tribe, where they say, we're not only going to have a common pasture, we're just going to have one common herd. And that perhaps is one way of solving the problem. Tribes can differ in a lot of other ways. So what happens when someone, again, encroaches on your herd? Do you have a strict code of honor where you have to go after and kill them and their family if someone does something nasty to one of your sheep? Or do you have a more harmonious attitude where you say, you know, we live and let live? Different tribes can have different, what I call proper nouns. So different texts, different leaders, different gods that they pray to. No two tribes are going to be praying to the same God, right? At least if these are tribes that evolved separately. So you can have a lot of different terms of cooperation. So now we have all these tribes cooperating internally under different terms around this forest. And then there's a big forest fire. The whole forest burns down. And the rains come, and suddenly there's this lovely new pasture in the middle. And all the tribes say, hey, that looks nice. And they all move in. And now the question is, how are they going to live on those new pastures? We have individualists and collectivists, and we have tribes that pray to this god versus that god and live by these rules versus that rules, and the ones who defend their honor fiercely and the ones who try to get along with more or less everybody. Those new pastures, that's the modern world. The modern world is not just about a bunch of individuals trying to get together and be cooperative. It's about a bunch of groups that are separately moral, differently moral, separately cooperative, but differently cooperative, all trying to live together in the same space. Now, you've got the individualist herders, and you've got the collectivist herders. Now, other issues are much closer to, farther from abstract political philosophy and closer perhaps to religion. So as you know, we have great disagreement about, for example, gay marriage, great disagreement about what to do about abortion, and a lot of people's religious convictions, which are ultimately religions at least begin as tribal as tribal institutions. They're appealing to the culture, to the moral norms of their tribe to adjudicate these problems. So two problems. There's the basic cooperation problem that Hardin identified, getting individuals to form a cooperative group. And you can think of that as me versus us. And then there's the problem of us versus them, or the problem of us's, the problem of the modern moral problem of forming a larger group, where it's not about selfishness versus morality, although that's how it may appear to be. What it's really about is different moral ideals, different moral values competing against each other. And so the modern moral problem is not how do you stop people from being bad? How do you stop people from being immoral? I mean, that's a problem too. The modern moral problem is how do you deal with a bunch of different moralities with people all trying to live together, and of course with people having all of the self-serving biases that you see at the individual level pulling for me, you see it at the higher level pulling for us. Okay, changing gears to the interior of the mind for the moment. Morality fast and slow. So my favorite analogy for this, and many of you are familiar with this idea presumably from books by Daniel Kahneman and Dan Ariely, the idea that we have gut reactions and we also have more deliberate thinking. My favorite analogy for this is with the modern digital SLR camera. So if you've got a camera like this, you've got your automatic setting like landscape and portrait, click, point and shoot, takes care of everything, and you've got your manual mode where you can set all of the settings yourself. Why do you have these two things? Well, it allows you essentially to navigate the trade-off between efficiency and flexibility, right? So the point and shoot settings, they're very efficient, point and shoot, and they're good for most things, but they're not very flexible. So if you're doing something typical, picture of a mountain from a mile away, that works great. But if you're doing something fancy, not so good. The manual mode is great because it's flexible, you can do anything with it, but it's not very efficient. You have to know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you might make a mistake. So having both is what enables you to toggle back and forth and have efficiency when you need it and flexibility when you need it. Well, the human brain has essentially the same design. And our automatic settings are our gut reactions, which are essentially emotional responses to the situations that life puts before us. And our manual mode is our capacity for deliberate reasoning. Automatic settings are good when you have kind of experience to draw on that's informed your gut reactions in a wise way. And manual mode is better when you're facing a situation that is fundamentally different. So let me give you an illustration from my own research of morality, fast and slow. So how many of you have heard of the trolley problem? The original version of the trolley problem, one of them goes like this. So you have the switch case. Trolley is headed towards 5 people. And they're going to die if you don't do anything. But you can hit a switch that will turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto the 1. You ask people, I won't make you raise your hands, most people, is it okay to hit the switch to minimize the number of deaths? And most people say yes. Okay, next case. The trolley is headed towards 5 people. This time you're on a footbridge over the tracks in between the oncoming train and the 5 people there. And the only way you can save them is to push this big person who's standing next to you off of the tracks, off of the bridge and onto the tracks. So you kind of use him as a trolley stopper. He'll die, but the 5 people will live. Now, most people say that it's not okay to push the guy off the footbridge and use him as a trolley stopper, even making all those assumptions that you don't want to make because you'd rather wiggle out of the problem. So what's going on here? Well, a lot of research, which I can only describe briefly, suggests that it's a gut reaction. It's an emotional response. We've seen this in the brain, which I'll describe in a moment, that's making you say, no, don't push that guy off the footbridge. And it's a more controlled, conscious cost-benefit analysis that's making you say that it's better to kill one to save 5 people. How do we know this? I'll give you one example. If you look at people who have damage to a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is essential for integrating emotional responses into decisions, those people are about 5 times more likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge or do other harmful things in order to save more lives. And people have done research with giving people different kinds of psychoactive drugs and a whole lot of things. Gut reaction making you say no, cost-benefit reasoning making you say yes. So that's one example of fast and slow. Another example of our gut reactions, our intuitions not serving us well in the global sphere, or at least creating a kind of inconsistency. So a long time ago, philosopher Peter Singer posed the following dilemma to the affluent world. He said, suppose you're walking along and there's a child who's drowning in this pond, and you can wade in and save this child's life. But you will ruin your fancy new Italian loafers and your suit if you do this. Now, how many of you think it's okay to let the child drown because you're worried about your $1,000 clothes or whatever they are? How many people think that's okay? No hands are going up for those of you who are watching at home. All right. Now, different case. Somewhere on the other side of the world, there are children who are badly in need of food and medicine, and a donation of, say, $500 or $1,000 can probably save someone's life, maybe several people's lives. At least it has a good chance. And you say to yourself, well, I'd like to save them, but I was thinking of buying a nice set of clothes. I have older clothes, but I'd like some new ones. How many people think you're a moral monster if you spend your money on things you don't really need but are nice to have instead of using it to save starving children on the other side of the world? Okay, this time no hands are going. How many people think it's okay, it's morally permissible to do that? Well, all of your hands should be going up because we all do this, myself included. So what's going on here? So with a student, Jay Musin, we wanted to do a more controlled experiment version of this. So what we did was we borrowing ideas from philosopher Peter Unger. One version goes like this. You're on vacation in this lovely but poor country. You have your little cottage up in the mountains overlooking the coast, and a terrible typhoon hits. And there's devastation along the coast. There's flooding. People don't have food. The sewage is everywhere, and the disease is becoming a big problem. Do you have an obligation to help? And in our sample, 68%, if I recall correctly, said that you have an obligation to help. And the way you help, don't go down there. Just make a donation to the aid organization that's already working on the ground. So a majority of people say that you have an obligation to help in that case. We ask a different group of people, randomly assigned. They say, everything's the same as the way I described it before, except now your friend is there, and you're at home, and your friend has a smartphone and is showing you everything that's going on. You know everything that your friend knows about the terrible typhoon, and you have just as much ability to help. You can donate to this international aid organization just as easily. So the only difference is, are you at home or are you there as you imagine this scenario? And now about half as many people say that you have an obligation to help. It's kind of strange in a way, right? I mean, everything's the same. The situation's the same. You have all the same knowledge. You have the same ability to help. Just where are you sitting, right? Makes a huge difference. Well, why should that be? Well, from a certain perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you think about this like a biologist, it makes a lot of sense that we evolved, as I said, to cooperate in small groups. And if there's someone in your tribe who's drowning right in front of you, well, you're better off saving that tribe member. People on the other side of the world, they either don't exist to you or they're the competition, right? So it makes sense that we have this split from a biological perspective, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes moral sense. It makes sense biologically that we have heartstrings, but the strings are very short, right? You can't pull them very easily from across the world. This is a case where I think there's a kind of myopia in our gut reactions. Let me give you one more example. So this is we're talking about international affairs. A lot of the problems we deal with are very sort of big problems involving large numbers of people. The way we think about large numbers of people, it's also a very unnatural thing to do. Would you like to save 10,000 lives this way or 20,000 lives that way? Not the kind of question our hunter-gatherer ancestors were facing. So how do we think about these things? So with a student, Amitai Shenhav, we did a brain imaging study where we had people make judgments about saving people's lives. So we say, okay, you're on this rescue boat, Coast Guard, you can save this one person who's drowning for sure, or you can change course and save these other people over there. And we vary the number of people you could save. It could be 1, 2, 5, 20, 40, and we vary the probability that you can actually save them. So you have a 50% chance of saving them. To make a reasonable decision, you have to keep track of how many lives are at stake, what are the odds of saving them, right? And put that together. And we found the part of the brain that seems to be keeping track of the magnitude, and a part of the brain that seems to be keeping track of the probability, and a part of the brain, in fact, the one I pointed to before, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, among others, that is integrating those two pieces of information for something like expected moral value. Now, that's interesting, I think, in and of itself. But one thing that was interesting especially is the parts of the brain that are doing this are the same parts of the brain that in humans, if you have people making self-interested financial decisions, you can have $1 or a 50-50 chance of winning $1.50 or $2.50. Same parts of the brain, same system seems to be keeping track of the magnitude and the probability for these gambles. And it's really the same systems that you see making decisions about things like food in an animal like a rat, right? Should I go for the cheap, easy food here, or go foraging for the really good stuff that I might not be able to get? It's the same kind of problem for a rat. Now, something interesting about our responses to problems with large numbers of lives at stake, or whatever it is that it seems we exhibit this kind of diminishing returns, where you'd say the first few lives you can save, that feels really important. But the difference between saving 100 lives and 105 lives, people don't react very differently to that. 10,000 lives versus 11,000 lives, it all kind of feels the same. Why is that? Well, the problem may be that we're essentially using our rat brains to think about these global problems involving large numbers of lives. So if you're a rat, the goods you're dealing with, like food, exhibit diminishing returns. You don't have a fridge, right? You can't save this stuff for later. Once you're full, you're full. It's not worth that much more. There's only so much you can eat. There's only so many times you can mate, or whatever it is that you're interested in as a rat. And that's what our basic neural evaluation system was designed for. And now we take that ancient mammalian system for attaching values to behavioral options, and we're using it to think about things like saving large numbers of lives around the world. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, and maybe there's a way to correct out of this, and that's what I want to talk about finally. This is this idea of common currency. So coming back to the parable of the new pastures, that is, we have different tribes with different values, some more individualist, some more collectivist, some pray to these gods, some pray to those gods, different ideas about things like gay marriage or abortion or whatever it is. How can we all get along? Well, I'll tell you, I don't think there's a magic bullet solution, but I do think there's a way of thinking about these things that is better than what we currently do. And I think that the people who originally got this right were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the late 18th and 19th century. So what was their idea? So they were, first of all, Mill and Bentham were kind of amazing. They were way ahead on almost every major social issue of their day. They were among the first opponents of slavery, among the first proponents of free markets, workers' rights, what we now call women's rights, all of that stuff. They were way ahead. How did they get so far ahead? Well, I have a psychological hypothesis, but let me put this in more abstract philosophical terms first. So they began with two basic questions. So one is, who really matters, and the other is what really matters. So the who really matters, their answer is essentially the golden rule. That is, everybody's interest counts equally. Now, this is a very untribal thing to think. What you normally think is, well, I, myself, my people, we count more, and those people over there count less. But if you try to think of what would a global meta-morality look like, that is, trying to have a moral system that adjudicates among competing tribal values in the same way that ordinary morality adjudicates among competing individual interests, this meta-morality, it's going to have to be impartial. So that's one. And then the other part of it, and this is the more controversial part, is they said, what really matters, our real common currency, is our human experience, our capacity to be happy, our capacity to suffer. And what they said is that if you think about all of the things that you value and ask, why do I care about that? And then say, and why do I care about that? And why do I care about that? Until you run out of answers. They say it all ultimately comes down to the quality of your experience. So if you say, well, why does it matter to be honest? Well, when you're dishonest, it hurts people. Well, what do you mean it hurts people? They lose money or something like that? Oh, well, they lose money. Well, why is it bad if people lose money? Well, then they can't have what they need to support themselves. Well, why do they need money? You go on, and ultimately it comes down to somebody's well-being in the experience sense of avoiding their happiness or avoiding their suffering or promoting their happiness. Now that's highly controversial, but that's at least a plausible idea. And so you put this idea together and you say, well, happiness, suffering, experience, that's the value behind our other values. That's how they all cash out. And if we're going to have some kind of universal moral system, it's going to have to be impartial. And so they said, well, we should try to maximize happiness in an impartial way. Now, most philosophers today think this is a terrible idea because there have been tons of counterexamples, intuitive counterexamples. I gave you one, the footbridge case. It seems wrong to kill that guy in order to save those extra lives, right? Hold that thought and just join me in just thinking about this in the abstract. I think it was this more abstract thinking that enabled them to make wonderful progress. And a particularly striking example of this comes from Jeremy Bentham, who in around 1785 penned one of the first defenses of what we now call gay rights. Now, some of you may be in the current issue here is gay marriage here in the United States at this time. Some of you are for, some of you here may be against. But in Bentham's time, not only was gay marriage not legal, gay sex was punishable by death. And I'm assuming that most of you think that that's not okay. But at the time, everybody thought that was okay, except for Bentham. So how did he get to this crazy idea? Well, he had this moral framework. He had done a lot of thinking about morality and came to the conclusion that the quality of experience is what ultimately matters, and that we should be looking at the quality of experience from an impartial perspective. And he said to himself, I've been trying for years to figure out how to justify the rules that we have against being gay. And I can't do it. So maybe it's actually not so bad. And with that crazy thought, crazy at the time, he leapt ahead 2 centuries in moral thinking. That's manual mode. That's thinking slow, right? He had the same gut reactions as everybody else, but he didn't take them too seriously. Or he took them seriously, but he didn't give them veto power, so to speak, over his own moral thought. Now, those gut reactions are very good. And let me go back to the case of the trolley, because this is the kind of thing that has convinced most philosophers that this kind of thinking is terrible. It's good that we have negative emotional responses to pushing each other off of footbridges. It's good, right? We don't want people going out and being violent. And then you create this bizarre circumstance in which committing this act of interpersonal violence is guaranteed, we stipulate, to promote the greater good. Well, that's no wonder you've got your automatic settings in tension with your manual mode in that case. But our gut reactions, those automatic settings, are not necessarily as reliable as you might think. And let me give you an experimental example of this. So we ask people, you might ask, what is it that triggers that emotional response? Well, we give people a version of the footbridge case like I described. About 30% of people in this sample say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. Describe it differently so that instead of pushing the guy with your bare hands, there's a trap door on the footbridge, and all you have to do is hit a switch that will drop the guy onto the tracks. Now twice as many people, a majority, about 60-something%, say that it's okay. It's the difference between pushing with your hands and dropping with a switch. Now, that doesn't seem like something that matters morally. It's the similar thing like the distance in the charitable giving case. Now, it's good that you don't like the idea of pushing people off of footbridges. It's not something that we want to train out of people. But I think it's a mistake to use these kinds of weird hypothetical cases and allow them to have veto power over our candidates for a global moral philosophy. So let me try to put this all together. 2 kinds of moral problems. The tragedy of the commons, the basic moral problem that we evolved to solve with our gut feelings. And there, I think it makes sense to rely on our gut feelings. That's what we evolved to do. The tragedy of common sense morality, the modern moral problem, the problem of dealing with different groups, with different values, with different interests. What we need is a common currency. We need some kind of higher order system that we can appeal to in order to allow groups with different values to get along. And that higher order system is not going to feel good, because what feels good is what evolved to feel good for our basic moral interactions with people in everyday life. But if we want to have some kind of a system where we can make trade-offs among groups with different ideals, we're going to need some kind of more abstract system that's sort of everybody's second moral language. It's not the language we speak most comfortably, but it's the one that we can all kind of agree on. And you might say, I get this all the time, well, if you're looking at evidence for evidence about what's going to promote people's happiness, of course, my side's going to say what I want promotes people's happiness, and the other side's going to say what I want is going to promote people's happiness. Well, that's true. But at least there's a fact of the matter. At least with 10 steps forward and 9 steps back, we can figure out what actually promotes human happiness and what actually doesn't. And it's a messy, biased process, but at least there's a tractable goal. Whereas if we just think about what rights we believe in, our rights, I think, and I'm not going to defend this point here, our conceptions of rights are really just fronts for our gut reactions. Whatever we feel in our hearts, we say, this is what rights we have, or this is what duties we have. So my general advice is, when it comes to the morality of everyday life, of individuals versus groups, me versus us, selfishness versus morality, think fast, mostly. But when it comes to the problems of the modern world, you're going to have to think slow. And we're going to have to find a common currency. And you may or may not agree with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and me that trying to ground this in a conception of morality where what ultimately matters is global happiness, you may or may not agree with that. But I think that's the only way that we're going to find a kind of international sort of ethic. So Immanuel Kant famously said at the end of the Critique of Practical Reason that there are 2 things that fill his heart with wonder: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. I actually think the moral law within is a mixed blessing. It allows us to get along with each other, but it also creates the modern moral problems that we face, the problems that really divide us. And what fills me with wonder is our capacity to do both, to have these gut reactions and take them seriously, but to also step back from them and perhaps reason our way to something better. So, thanks very much.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.